Hey, Christina Simmons from Say Yes to Holiness here. And just a quick reminder about if you're listening to this on your favorite podcast platform, make sure to hit subscribe and also the notifications button. And if you're watching this on YouTube, then also become a follower and also get notifications so that when I go live, then you'll get notified and be able to get that extra content that I put out on the Say Yes to Holiness YouTube channel. So thank you so much for your support. And without further ado, let's jump into that food for the head, heart, hands, and feet. So our food for the head comes from St. Leo the Great. He says, "No one, however weak, is denied a share in the victory of the cross. No one is beyond the help of the prayer of Christ." I think so often in our world today, because things look so dire. In fact, if you're listening in real time, there is now Middle Eastern conflict again. There was another rocket strike on Israel, from Hamas, and we're looking around and we're seeing a political system that is completely in disarray here in the United States. And the fact is that we can really begin to think that victory hasn't been won, because all we do is see pain and suffering and conflict and chaos. The war in the Ukraine is still happening. I mean, again, just tons of stuff. But the fact is that we need to have faith in God's promises for us, especially his desire for us to be with him for all eternity, where darkness and sin and death are no more. The victory has been won. But the fact is that no one is beyond sharing in the cross. And this is where we have to remember, in order to us have a share in the victory, we also have to have a share in the cross. Now, it's going to look different for everybody, but very simply means that we're going to run into difficulties. We're going to run into sadness. We're going to run into pain. We're going to run into suffering, not just, and death, not just in the world at large, but in our own lives too. And we have to suffer through it. When we suffer through it, though, we need to remember that if we remain faithful and we persevere, then God is going to bring good out of all things. But that's really tough, isn't it? It's very easy to become discouraged. It's very easy to even stop trying, especially trying to pursue holiness, which is what hopefully you're jumping onto this podcast and listening to it is in order to help you remain inspired and encouraged to be able to keep walking towards sanctity. We got to continue the journey, everybody. We got to do all in our power to continue on this pilgrimage toward heaven. And we can do this if we keep at the forefront of our mind what St. Leo was talking about, is that regardless of our weaknesses, regardless of our failings, we will have a share in the victory of the cross, even if we might be feeling the sting of the cross at that moment, or even in this very moment. But even when we feel the sting, remember, you're not alone. We are not alone. We're definitely not beyond the help of Christ if we ask. And so often our pride gets in the way, or we think that it's not going to matter, so we don't even ask. But we need to ask. We need to say, Lord, make me come to you, like Peter did. The gospel story, Peter walking on water, was about, Lord, if it's you, command me to come and walk on water. And he did, until he began to doubt, until he took his eyes off of Christ. We do the same. So we need to ask the help of Christ. We need to remember that it doesn't matter how we failed. It doesn't matter how many times we've fallen down. We will have a share of the victory of the cross if we ask. So offer up that prayer. Have faith. And make sure that you do like Peter did. And you get out of the boat. Our food for the heart comes from one of my favorite saints, Edith Stein. Her official religious name is Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, but she's better known by her secular name, Edith Stein. But she wrote, "Just take everything exactly as it is, put it in God's hands, and leave it to Him. Really rest and start the next day as a new life." What she suggests for us, I would say, is probably the short primer of how you can experience peace in your day. Take everything that's going on, put it in God's hands, leave it to Him, and then really rest. And then start that next day as a new life. So whatever's going on for you right now, whatever might be weighing on you, whatever it is that is maybe causing you anxiety, or maybe you're just kind of going down a rabbit hole thinking about it all the time, whatever it is, might be financial worries, might be how the job is going, it might be how are the kids doing, might be one particular child who's struggling right now. Go and take everything exactly as it is. Put it in God's hands. Leave it to Him. And then really rest in His arms. And then begin the next day as a new life. If you think about it, if you don't know Edith Stein's story, St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, she was actually killed at Auschwitz. She was arrested, and eventually she was killed as a martyr to the faith at Auschwitz. And if she was able to live this out, which she did, obviously, think about there can't be anything much more devastating to have your freedom taken away, to be denied just the barest, everything except the barest subsistence of food and clothing and shelter, to know that your chance of surviving is a glimmer, not even a glimmer of a possibility, but yet you can find rest and peace in the midst of that. And she did. So again, how do we find this peace? How do we find this rest? Take whatever it is that's before us, entrust it to God, give it to Him, and find rest in His presence. As long as we trust Jesus, we have nothing to fear. And we'll be able to truly rest and to start each new day as a new life. So entrust it all to Him. One of my favorite phrases is always been from the Surrender Novena, the mantra that you repeat, which is, Jesus, I surrender it all to you. Take care of everything. Our food for the hands comes from St. Clare of Assisi. Love God, serve God. Everything is in that. Now, St. Clare, you could argue, was a model disciple of Christ, particularly in pursuing the way that was laid out by St. Francis of Assisi, and that was that path of simplicity and poverty and obedience. Clare was a wealthy young woman. She came from a wealthy family. And she had everything laid out for her. She would have had a very comfortable and easy life relative to the 1200s. But the fact is that when she heard Francis preach, her heart was literally set on fire. And she determined that she was going to set aside everything in order to pursue a relationship with Christ, how St. Francis was talking about living it. That meant she had to give up everything. She gave up her position as a high-born and wealthy daughter of an Italian count in the small town of Assisi. When you think about a small town, that means that they were like the people. Everybody knew who they were. Everybody, deferred. But Claire set it all aside. She set aside the fact that she wasn't going to have fine things. She wasn't going to have wealth. She wasn't going to have any position in society anymore. Instead, she lives a very simple life as a beggar, pursuing God in prayer in a convent. In fact, I had the opportunity to visit San Damiano, where Claire and her sisters lived, and where she was until her death. She left twice, I think. My husband would correct me with the particular number, but I think it was only twice that she ever left those convent walls after she entered into them. And one was to visit St. Francis on his deathbed. But it was something of where she found all that she needed in the simple walls of San Damiano. And it's a tiny little place. It has beautiful views. I still remember looking out the actual window of her prayer garden, and pretty much it was a 4x4. It was smaller than a prison cell, but it looked out onto a grassy field. And so you could see, grass and trees and look up towards the mountains just above Assisi. And that was her garden space. That was where she would commune with Jesus. That was where she was able to pursue God in prayer. We are invited to do similarly, to love God and to serve Him. Just as Claire says in her, says here, love God, serve God. Everything is in that. Everything is in that. If we love God and we serve Him in this moment, the best that we can, everything is in that. If we love God, that means that we're going to try and love others around us the best that we can. It means that we're going to hopefully not lose our temper when little ones, if we have little ones, are, getting on our last nerve. Or when our spouse might ask us to do something for the 100th time, or ask us to do something that we're like, why can't they do it? But instead, because we love God, we serve others around us as a way to serve Him, because each person is His face. Mother Teresa of Calcutta talks about it all the time, about the fact of, people were like, how can you go and serve the poor, serve those who are dying, serve those who are diseased, and, how can you do that? And she's like, because I see the face of Christ. I'm taking care of Christ. And that's what we have to do. The great conversion story of St. Francis of Assisi was he was hesitating to truly love, Christ. And And one of the biggest things is he was afraid of lepers. And finally, he overcame that. And he came upon a leper, and he kissed him. He had physical contact with him. Now, back in the 1200s, if you had contact with a leper, there was a good chance that you yourself would contract leprosy. So he was condemning himself, potentially, to also dying of this dreaded disease. But Francis did so. And in that moment, after he did, he saw Christ in that leper. So this is how God works, is that he invites us into a deeper love than we think is even possible. And when we step out, when we reach out, when we attempt to love more than we think we can, then he gives us the grace, number one. But number two, we find him. It's one of those interesting paradoxes. But everything is in that. Everything is in loving God and serving him. Not as a servant. Remember, he calls us friends. But rather, we serve him because we love him. Aren't you willing to do anything for the person that you love? When you love someone, you don't think about the cost, do you? And that's exactly what we have to remember. To not think about the cost, but rather love God, serve him. Everything is in that. Our food for the feet comes from Saint Jane Frances de Chantal. She wrote, "Hold your eyes on God and leave the doing to him. That is all the doing you have to worry about." Saint Jane de Chantal, if you aren't aware, she herself was a wife and a mother before she became a nun and then founder of a religious community. She was a woman of great beauty and refinement. And she herself just naturally was lively, cheerful in her temperament. She married when she was 21. She had 6 children. 3 of them died when they were infants. So she knew sorrow. She knew grief. But she worked and tried to do various charitable works. Only 7 years, so she had these 6 children relatively quickly, like every year almost. She became a widow at the age of 32 then. So at age 28, she was a widow. 4 years later, she met the great Saint Francis de Sales. He became her spiritual director. And through his direction, she grew in holiness. She grew in her capacity to be able to love God and serve him. And eventually, after her children were grown, she desired to become a nun. And St. Francis de Sales, told her, "Hey, you got kids, so after, they have grown, and that is when she eventually became a nun." But it's something where we have to remember that the call, what we know we need to do, might not be that itself is going to happen right now. So let me explain. So many times what it is that we need to, we know where we're going, but there's things that have to be done before we can get there, right? So take, for example, a very secular example. Someone wants to become a doctor. Well, you don't just go and become a doctor. You have to study. You have to go to medical school. You have residency. There's a whole bunch of things that has to happen before you become that doctor. But you knew more than a decade ago, for most, that is what they wanted to do. So it seems like you're deferring you're going to school, you're doing residency, etc., etc. But the fact is that you're moving and you're growing and you're being formed in the process. So for St. Jane, what happened is that Francis helped her when she discerned, I want to be a nun. I want to, have a community of women and to live with them and to serve God. So into the midst of that, Francis is like, you have responsibilities. You have your children you need to raise to adulthood. In the interim, let's begin that process. Let's begin that work. And so with Francis's guidance, Jane, founded an institute for women who their health or their age or other considerations prevented them from being able to become religious. Every religious community, if you were not aware, has particular guidelines and restrictions for how old can you be when you enter, for example, or if you have pre-existing health conditions of different parts that you can't join the community, or if you're formally married, or if you have kids, or that kind of thing. So that was the same thing back in the 1200s. So what Francis did is he helped Jane be able to begin to form the community of nuns that eventually she would be able to join, because gathered these women, they formed an institute. There was no cloister. In other words, they still were out in the world. And the biggest thing about that was so that they could continue to undertake spiritual and corporal works of mercy. And the focus became to exemplify the virtues of Mary at the visitation. Their humility, weakness, meekness. Gosh, I'm misspeaking today. I'm sorry, guys. So particularly Mary's humility and her meekness, her obedience, and especially of the devotion to the Blessed Sacrament and spending time in adoration every day. Eventually, the name of the order that St. Jane founded was the Visitation Nuns, and they continue to this day to hold their eyes on Jesus, set aside their worries, leave the doing to Him as they are doing spiritual and corporal works of mercy. Mary, of course, did this each and every day of her life, before and then during and then after the life of Jesus. And this is the rule. This is the plan of life that we too are invited to do as well. We're invited to trust in God. We're invited to say yes to God's invitation to love Him and serve Him. We're invited to set everything into His hands and leave it to Him and rest with Him. We're invited to keep our eyes on God and leave the doing to Him, even as we might be sharing in the cross, remembering that we also have a share in the victory that came from the cross. So we need to be attentive to how it is that God desires us to come to Him, of how He desires us to not worry anymore. So say yes to that, and then leave the worrying to God.